So good afternoon and welcome to this talk on flexible funding, the future of tech for good. I'm joined here today with Dalia from Comic Relief, and we'll both just give a very brief intro before we get started. Dalia, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, and thanks for starting us off, Charné. Hi everyone, hope you've had a nice afternoon so far. I'm Dalia, I work in the social tech team at Comic Relief. Social tech alongside support for change is one of our approaches in our funding social change strategy. My day-to-day job is portfolio manager, which means that I take care of our co-funded portfolios of Tech for Good and Tech versus Abuse. We co-fund these and many others with other co-funders like Paul Hamlin Foundation, Esme Fairburn and Cloth Workers, supporting non-profits with digital innovation and specifically funding them to use digital to respond to a service delivery issue.
Thanks, Dalia. And my name is Charné. I work for an organisation called CAST. We're the Centre for Acceleration of Social Technology, and we support charities to use digital for social good. I head up most of our Funded Plus work, which we'll be speaking a little bit more about in a while, but mainly supporting charities on their digital journey, whether that be whether they're right at the start of their journey, kind of somewhere in the middle, or they're further along, looking at different ways that we can support them through facilitated learning, peer learning, and also coaching. Great. So just to add before we get started, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end, but if at any stage while we're speaking anything's unclear or you've got any questions, please feel free to drop any questions into the chat. My colleague Sonia is also on the call and she'll be supporting with our technical setup, but also keeping an eye on the chat. So Sonia's around if you've got any questions, and we'll pick those up at the end. Great. So, Dalia, I'll hand over to you.
Sure. So I'm just going to kick off by setting the scene a little bit and explaining how social tech sits within Comic Relief and what our approach is and how we define it. So again, I should say that I'm personally not sort of super tech expert. I'm just a grant manager who works in social tech, and over the past 2 years, I've learned a lot about what makes charities' digital journey successful and what they really need to make them reach their potential. So what is social tech? Social tech to us is the intentional design, development and use of digital tech to address social challenges. And the really core ethos of it for us is that it's designed with the needs and the wants of the people who are going to be using it at its heart. So there's a real emphasis on co-production, co-design and use of research to our approach. Our long-term goals of our funding are to increase organisations' digital capabilities and strengthen the funding ecosystem for digital. So that both means everything from funders thinking about how to incorporate this into their work, and the agencies and digital agencies that support organisations to develop digital projects. As opposed to most of Comic Relief's other work, we've taken a flexible approach to our social tech funding, which I'll go into on more detail in another slide. And I guess you could call it agile, even though we try and avoid using jargon like that with our organizations. And our methodology does differ from traditional funding programs. And so it centers around the adoption of digital tech to meaningfully improve services. But just wanted to add that these models of flexible funding don't necessarily have to just apply to digital. In fact, we're learning about how they can generate greater learning across the funding community. So for example, the centrality of use of research, the agile approach, really intersects with emerging focuses at the moment within the funding world on participation and inclusion in building services and delivery for people. So where maybe more traditional funding models are outcomes driven with activities stated up front, and again, these are absolutely appropriate for a lot of cases. I also want to say that lots of funders have flexed their funding recently, providing more core and unrestricted funding since the COVID-19 crisis has forced organisations to adapt to a new world. But a lot of this more flexible funding has focused on short-term emergency responses, kind of looking at tech for business continuity and the service delivery, as opposed to really using it to think about how you can use different components of digital to really meaningfully improve your services. So I guess the question our funding kind of seeks out to solve is, you know, what if an organization has a good problem statement, knows what issue they want to solve in their service, knows that digital could be a solution, but they don't really have the funding or the time to explore how this could work in practice and to really incorporate user research into that. I think a lot of our research and our learning from running the fund over 4 to 5 years now has shown us how important that initial time and energy investment is, including kind of adequately funding the right post internally in an organization to thinking about how to most meaningfully develop services. And I think on that, I'll hand over to Charné for the next slide to really explain a bit more about what we mean by that freedom and the agility of that funding.
Thanks, Dalia. So as Dalia mentioned, things really are changing within the landscape, and I think COVID has kind of given things a bit more of a push as well. And as I mentioned in my intro, one thing that we try and do at CAST is try and meet charities where they're at. So we find that many organizations that approach us for help are at very different stages of their digital journey, and that they require different support. Some require a bit more in-depth, some a bit more kind of light touch support, and we try and flex based on what's needed. So traditionally we've found that a lot of the approach with funding has been quite solution based, so requiring lots of charities and organizations to have fixed budgets, very fixed outcomes, and reporting, strict reporting that kind of aligns to those outcomes. And that's great if you really are very sure about the solution that you're intending to build or that you're working towards at the start of your funding program. It's not always the best approach if you are still starting out in your digital journey and if you're trying to create something that's never been done before. So we've tried to take a more kind of test and learn approach, and trying to avoid jargon. So we generally don't really talk about agile, but I put it in here just because that's generally how it would be referred to. But when we work with organizations, we generally try and avoid the jargon, because we can find that a lot of the time tech and digital space can be quite inaccessible just because of the complex language that's used. And we really want to try and build the confidence of project leads and organizations to know what they're talking about and to feel confident in the decisions that they make. So we take a very test and learn approach, and sometimes that requires organizations to change direction. And there's an example that I'll share a little bit later on about that. And a lot of the support that we provide on our Funded Plus programs is focused around responsive design. So it's really focused on user needs and behaviors. We teach organizations how to do in-depth user research and how to interpret those results to actually drive out some of the key user needs and begin to prioritize what they'd like to address. And a lot of the work that we do with charities is often responding to new and emerging needs. So like I said, often with solution-based approaches, it's really difficult if it's something that's new and never been done before to kind of base your outcomes and the goals that you're setting on behaviors and interventions if there's no evidence to draw off. And oftentimes within the social sector and the charities that we work with, it's really a response to new and emerging behaviors. So it can be challenging to kind of predict what future behavior might be. So that's generally the approach that we take, and I think it really helps organizations to be a lot more responsive to the changing needs of the people that they support. And I'll hand back to you, Dalia.
Charné. So now I'll spend a bit of time talking about what's unique about this model, what the main features of our approach are, in case people are interested, kind of breaking it down in terms of what this means in practice for applicants and other funders in the room as well. So at application phase, applicants mainly apply with a really defined problem statement and evidence that they've done some user research to back this up. We don't hold them to the solution that they think will be the case at application point. So it's really focusing on a learning by doing approach throughout the funding program. And to that end, startup forums don't really go into detail on specific outcomes that they want to reach in terms of the products they want to build. We also ask For video applications, we found that this is a really, really brilliant way of getting to know organizations kind of personally and a bit informally through that format. We've also had feedback that it's relatively non-onerous for applicants doing these types of applications, and they can really show us, you know, the needs and show us the users if they like, of course. In terms of the actual funding journey, the funding program is structured so that it's really responsive to emerging needs across the funding period. So built in are opportunities for organizations to pivot and iterate their work. So if, for example, they've started off thinking that they need an iPhone app, for example, to solve their service delivery problem, and then realize that it's actually a much more simple solution that would make other users' lives easier, then, you know, there's no kind of penalization for that at the end of the funding process, and it's really encouraged. And I guess I also wanted to reiterate as well that, you know, this doesn't mean that, you know, they kind of it's uncontrolled. Actually, I think that it's actually much more highly structured and controlled than lots of other funding programs, just because they're really, we do with CAST support, and I'll come on to that in a minute, try and build in loads and loads of moments for peer learning, for cohort playbacks, for them to share what they've learned. I think I probably speak to these grantees a bit more than other grant managers as well. So yeah, it's just replaced by a much more structured model around these phases of discover, which is your use of research, define, and then develop. And just again to say that we try to be iterative too in our approach to this funding. So I think this year will be the 5th time, I think, that we've run Tech for Good. And each time we've slightly tweaked an aspect of the funding based on what our partners tell us. So whether that's slightly increasing the grant length or amount, or changing the way the support is delivered. And then finally, a really important core component to this work is Funder Plus and partnership working. So each cohort of funded organizations will have access to technical support from people like Charné at CAST. And we found that that's from feedback that's potentially one of the most useful elements of the program, just that really guided coaching and mentoring through this digital development process. And again, like I think we're finding much more with tech recently, that it's about the empathetic relationship that's developed between the coaches and the mentors that then gets cascaded to the way that that use of research is done, that makes this approach really successful, I think. And then next slide, thanks. It's just a bit more about that wraparound Funder Plus collaborative support that we commission and the different models that we use. So the first model is the model that we've been using for a few years now for Tech for Good and Tech First Abuse. It's a wraparound model that builds in support from a number of organizations who are contracted at the beginning of the funding program, with CAST so far playing a lead coaching and mentoring role, and then basically being that node that recognizes what digital support is needed and where it might come from and how to facilitate those connections with other agencies. So we have partners like Snook doing use of research, being involved, Dot Project, and founders and coders, and each of these agencies bring expertise in a different area of digital development, with CAST kind of pointing them in the right direction. And this approach is much more focused, and there's more time dedicated to each organization. And then we've got Explore, which we ran for the first time this year, actually, in response to research that we did last year that found that actually, you know, lots of organizations know that that digital might be a solution, but they just don't have the time or the energy to really scope out what that might look like in practice. So Explore was basically a really short, early stage discovery program that enabled, or is enabling, going on at the moment, around 40 organizations to access light touch support, and it's delivered by CAST over 12 weeks, receiving 5K each to cover their internal staff salaries, which has really allowed us to spread that support over a range of organizations. It's more of a self-serve approach where there's a brilliant kind of online training program that they can tap into, and there's a real community vibe there as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can do this, and these are some of the examples. Thanks. So just to quickly end on this, who else is doing this work at the moment? So I don't know a great deal about all these different funds and programs, but I think the key thing that runs through them all is the flexibility element. And there will be links to this in the blog that we're going to signpost to after this, so please do check them out. I know that, for example, Catalyst, National Lottery Community Fund, have just launched their discovery and development strands of grant making, so it's really brilliant to see there being other opportunities out there for organisations to explore within the safety of a funded call and the support that that offers, how digital might meaningfully improve their services.
Thanks, Dalia. So moving on to what we're learning, and just to give you an overview, Dalia mentioned the Tech for Good program. So this is one that we finished supporting recently. And this was a 9-month program funded by Comic Relief and the Paul Hanlon Foundation. And coincidentally, we also had 9 charities that received funding of this program. And the funding pots are between 24K and 51K. And as Dalia mentioned earlier, they also get the added benefit of having some expert support and a dedicated coach throughout the 9-month program. We really focus on having kind of a user-centered and test-driven approach to how we develop tech during these programs. So we really spend a lot of time on user research, looking at what the different priorities are and what the user needs are that need to be addressed. And also then discussing, I guess, what's feasible during the time that's available for the program. Some of the partners that we worked with on this program have been Snook, Founders and Coders, and Dot Project, and there's been a real variety of supported skills that we've been able to draw on throughout the program, which has been fantastic because different organizations have needed more in-depth support in different areas throughout the program. So whether that be specifically in service design, or whether that be looking at consequence scanning, which is something that Everyone do a really great job at. And then also looking at things like developing prototypes or really small little user tests to begin to test a potential solution. So some of my images have disappeared, but what this funding has enabled, this is just some examples of some of the organizations we've worked with over the past 9 months. So we've worked with Bipolar UK, who are UK-based, a London-based organization rather, who were looking at kind of making sure that they could respond or be more responsive to the needs of their users. They were getting a lot of inquiries via email for support on bipolar, either for kind of people who were new to the diagnosis or people who wanted to support their loved ones. And they decided to just reuse some existing tech, and through that they've been able to free up hundreds of hours of staff time, which has been amazing. But again, a great example of an organization who kind of weighed up the options and decided to reuse some technology instead of building something from scratch, because that made more sense. We also work with Hestia, who are a domestic violence organization. Again, they kind of started with a really broad scope of work when we started the program, but through the support of their coach and also the support partners we've worked with, they were able to pivot because they had that freedom and that flexibility within the funding. And they decided to change direction based on their research, because they realized that the initial scope of the project and the initial kind of solution that they'd identify actually didn't make sense and was actually a bit too broad. So they were able to develop an app to help employers actually respond to workplace domestic abuse issues. And then finally, we also worked with Deaf Kids International, who are quite a small organization looking to really deliver some support to young children. So we're talking kind of under 10 in terms of the age group, and really educate them on their rights around kind of different types of physical interactions. And with them, again, we started with a really broad scope. And once we kind of dug down into the details, it became clear that the scope needed to be slightly refined. And they've been able to come up with a series of games, educational games for this age group. And beyond the program, they've been able to secure kind of further funding to further iterate on this game and build out some further kind of educational materials. And then finally, what we're learning, and this is just a snapshot, as Dalia mentioned, there is a blog where we've gone into a lot more depth that Sonia, I'm sure, will share in the chat. But really, some of the key things that we're learning is, first of all, around the dedicated project lead. That's something that we've recognized through this funding, is that really having that kind of time and that specific person in charge of, sorry, there's a helicopter passing up there. So yeah, having a dedicated project lead throughout the project lifestyle makes a really big difference in terms of the impact of the organization to make change, but also to kind of reach their outcomes and develop their skills. We had with most of the organizations we supported, this was the case. They had a dedicated project lead. There were a few where, due to organizational changes, they needed to slightly change staff and change resources. But this was one thing that all charities found was really beneficial, is kind of having that dedicated person. Dalia alluded to this earlier, so we do have playbacks at key milestones. So after each kind of phase of discovery, development, we have a playback where organizations will play back to their peers. And this really helps to kind of build confidence, but also builds in some of that accountability. And it's a way for teams to really communicate their progress effectively. And then dedicated time and space. This is always a challenge, and something that most organizations cited as the key challenge for engaging in their program, was kind of having that dedicated time and space to make meaningful progress and also develop their skills. Again, we find that having a project lead who can actually, have a set amount of time each week to kind of engage in the program really helps. And also the benefit is that they've then got the added advantage of taking full advantage of the support on offer. And finally is flexible support. So we found that at many stages during the program, we had to kind of rethink what we were offering and whether it still made sense. So check in each time to make sure that what we had on offer was still responding to the needs of the organizations. And obviously with COVID, that had a massive impact on the timelines of many organizations, but also just on their everyday working. And so we had to kind of tailor our support based on the changing needs to ensure that it was still fit for purpose. And I think the biggest learning for us has been that change is inevitable, and having that flexibility built in is really key to ensuring that you're really meeting the needs of the organizations that you're supporting. I'll hand back to you, Dalia.
Thanks, Charné. Great. So just a couple of, I guess, plugs for me to end on. What's next? So two main things. The first thing is that we're launching our main Tech for Good Build Fund in 2020. So I'm not quite sure who's on the call, but if any of you are a nonprofit and you've got the makings of a digital idea that you think might really radically, or not even so radically, transform the way that your users experience your service, this might be something for you to look into. Watch this link on the screen, which will have that funding opportunity when it opens. I think it will open in around December or January, and we'll try and promote it far and wide as well. And feel free to sort of approach me with any questions around that as well. And just to end on as well, if other opportunities for involvement, if you are a funder or another organisation and you're interested in funding this type of approach through us, again, feel free to approach me. Like I said, we co-deliver lots of our programs with other funders and organizations like Paul Hamlin Foundation and Esme Fairbairn. So there's definitely opportunity to create a sort of bespoke partnership or initiative there as well. It's just these two plugs from me.
Thank you. Thanks. So I think we've got some time for questions now. And yeah, just to add, I think we mentioned a few times the blog. So if you'd like any follow-up information on anything that we've shared today, please do check out the blog. And Sonia, if you don't mind dropping the link into the chat box, it's already there. But beyond that, if there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself. Sonia, I don't know if there's any questions already.
Yes, there's one here. Is funding available for startups and social enterprises? My organisation is a CLG rather than a charity.
Great question. So we only fund non-profits. That doesn't mean you strictly have to be registered as a charity, but if you're a CIC, you would be eligible. So as if you have non-profit status.
Great. There's another one here actually, which is, do you know if there are any organisations out there that do kind of more bread and butter solutions for collections of small non-profits, such as website and CRM, that are like a kind of customizable but templated and supported approach? So we wouldn't have to use big commercial providers that cost a lot, or small ones where the support package may not always be so good.
There's a lot in that one. I'll maybe jump in and say there are a lot of partners available. So we've been working on a platform called Dovetail, where you can find a list of different providers who've had some experience of working with charities across the sector. I think kind of budgets and ongoing support is always a challenge, and so it's something that we spend quite a bit of time on, and we've worked with founders and coders on the Tech for Good program to help charities establish kind of what's needed when you're looking for a tech partner, how to work well with the tech partners, how to maintain a good relationship, and then also what to expect just in terms of fees. And I guess the starting point that we recommend is making sure that you kind of meet tech partners. Obviously, now that we're doing everything digitally, it will most likely be all online, but having an opportunity to meet them and just talk to them, because at the end of the day, it really is a relationship that you're building with a new partner. So ensuring that, you know, there's shared understanding and that you've got shared ways of working to make sure that the relationship will be more successful going forward is always a good place to start. Hope that helps.
Thank you. And just for anyone that's not on the chat, Harry has also added very helpfully commercial offerings such as Wix, Squarespace, WordPress.com, and Digital Candle for advice as well. We've had another question here as well from Joe, which is, if you have received some funding already to start a tech project but will need more to develop it, are you eligible to apply?
Yeah, you are. So as usual, the fund will be open to organisations with projects at pretty much any stage of development. I guess the one thing that we would probably look at and take into account is the ratio between sort of what our funding would contribute and then what else has already gone into it. But yeah, technically you would be eligible.
Brilliant, thank you. We don't have any other questions in the chat, so if anyone else has anything they'd like to ask, please do.
I've also just put a link to our Tech for Good Hub on the chat, which is a bit outdated now, but it's got lots of really interesting previous articles just about the process of undergoing a journey like this, whether you're a charity or a funder. So do check it out if you'd like to have a look.
Great, thank you. I think if nobody else has got any further questions, then we're probably okay to wrap up.
Yeah, great. So I think just to wrap up, just to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully that's been helpful, and you found some new insights and some new organizations to explore as well. If you'd like more information, as I said previously, please do check out the blog, where we've gone into a lot more depth around the funding models and the organizations that have benefited from that. And if there are any follow-up questions, please feel free to get in touch. Dalia, I think we can probably just add our emails in the chat. If anybody's got any questions, we'll be more than happy to answer that. So thanks for joining.
Thanks everyone. I've just reposted the blog links as well, in case anyone would like them.
Great.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Bye.